Hi, how are you? It's me, Arnold. I want to thank you for supporting Mark Thompson here on The Edge. Fantastic show with all the jokes and, all the commentary and the politics. I love it. You can listen to the show on iTunes or Stitcher, or you can just go to the damn website, edge-show.com.
This is The Edge with Mark Thompson.
Hi, it is Mark. Thank you for joining us. This is The Edge podcast. Yes, there are thousands of podcasts called The Edge, but you found the one with me, and thank you. Is it 6 years ago when we started this show? There were, I thought, so many podcasts that there couldn't possibly be more. And that's one of the reasons I didn't even think anybody would end up listening. And, it's not like we have a huge listenership, but we have a dedicated listenership, and I'm really grateful that you're hopefully among them. But anyway, now 6 years later, I feel as though there is a multiple of the original number that were hosting podcasts before. It seems celebrities, everybody's got a podcast. Talk show hosts, everybody's got a podcast. Athletes, everybody's got a podcast. And that's why, I know a lot of people on the Patreon model, and I just come from a free broadcast background. And I've always promised you that I wouldn't do commercials, and I also promised you that we'd give you the show for free. And I kind of feel like that's what I should do. So that's the thinking here. Still, I appreciate those who've stepped up. Lucy this week and also Travis this week both sent us a little something through the PayPal link on our website at edge-show.com. Grateful to you both. Grateful to anybody who clicks onto the Amazon link on our website. We get a little piece of whatever you buy at Amazon. We don't see what you buy. We don't know what you buy, but they spin off a little something. The same Amazon as you would normally use. But again, anywhere on our site that it says Amazon, if you click that, that'll take it through to Amazon, and they track the fact that you went there through our website. So, Derek Thompson from The Atlantic is here. He is terrific. We'll kind of go around the horn with him on some articles that I think you'll find of interest. But before we get to Derek, Michael Shure on the road in the Midwest talks to Americans about the upcoming election. And I asked Michael to make a prediction about Donald Trump. And I make the prediction as well. And then I'm curious as to your reaction, maybe your prediction. If you want to reach us, we're edgewithmarkthompson@gmail.com. So we'll start with Michael, get to Derek. Show runs almost exactly an hour, and let's get started.
This is The Edge.
The advantage, it means.
They let guy just spit on me for no reason.
That's horrible.
Is there some comfort in uncertainty, do you think?
You're a degenerate.
Because Australian Shepherds need action.
Wow. Yeah.
This is The Edge.
That's a self-loathing term that I use.
Oh, got it.
Whenever possible, we like to check in on politics. And there's one guy who has forgotten more about politics than most of us will ever know. He is our Michael Shure, everybody. He joins us by phone today because, Michael Shure, you have been on the road. I know you've been reporting from Ohio, and you've been interacting. First, I love that you've been in Ohio. It's a critical state, and it's part of that sort of that Midwestern part of the country that really is increasingly important in these elections, these presidential elections. And you've also, I believe you were talking to UAW workers as well.
That's right. Yeah. And, going into this trip, there was a feeling that, Ohio's a red state. They really sort of cleaned the map in 2018. The Republicans did in Ohio, with the exception of Sherrod Brown, who ran a race that maybe if it had been a few months longer, it would have been a little tighter, but he didn't have a very strong opponent, though I did speak to that opponent when I was in Ohio. But now, there have been some polls even in the days since that showed that Ohio is actually a lot closer than people think. And you're right, Mark. It's a place that is part of that Midwest that the Democrats have to find a way to get back, not just Ohio, but the kind of voter that's in Ohio, the kind of Democrat that has been sort of a legacy Democrat in that part of the country. And so it was fascinating to see that and to talk to people about, that there are cities that have been crumbling because of the labor exodus from Ohio. And we did a story on Lordstown. Lordstown is where GM has closed a plant. They're striking in Lordstown, but many of those workers have had to move to Kentucky, to Indiana, Western Ohio, Ohio. Some have gone to Texas just to be able to keep their jobs and earn their pensions. So it's broken families apart. It has taken a toll because of the travel that's involved. And, it's really a crisis in that part of the country. Since we did the story, as a matter of fact, the next day, the UAW has announced that they reached a settlement with GM, but it doesn't seem like the Lordstown plant is part of that it will reopen. And that part of the country, Lordstown, Youngstown, Eastern Ohio, those places really get hit hard when these exoduses happen.
Let me just ask about the working class voter who does occupy so much of that country and that you've just referenced here in describing that part of the country. They, I think it's fair to say, feel let down a bit, in recent history by the Democratic Party.
They do. I think they feel taken for granted by the Democratic Party, that things have not gone as well, that there has not been a preparation or an acknowledgement that these jobs are important to their party as well as obviously to the fabric of the communities that they live in and in which they spend their money. So the trickle down and the ripple effect of these types of manufacturing jobs have an effect on politically as well. And I think the fact that they're starting to realize that a little bit late does point to the fact that they're going to run hard for these voters who may have left the party, may have gone and voted for Donald Trump, and then have found disillusionment there because the promises he made. You'll recall he was in Lordstown, Ohio. He was in that part of the country, and he told people not to sell their homes, to keep their homes. Well, you couldn't sell a home in Lordstown today, and those jobs are not there, and that factory has not been sort of repurposed at all. And again, it's early, but there's no plan right now to see that happen, which could cause a lot of these people some disillusionment with Trump. But you're right, the Democrats are the ones who have suffered because those are votes that have been theirs for a while. We talked to Tim Ryan, the congressman from Ohio, who is a Democrat, who's also a presidential candidate, who really feels that the party itself is not looking at how important that part of the country is, and that's why he thinks he's a good candidate for the president. Of course, he hasn't had the money and he hasn't had the traction that others have because of his name recognition, but his message is certainly not lost on people there.
This is interesting. You just, in referencing him, you give me another question I want to ask you, but before I do, I just want to make a comment, which is, if you feel orphaned by the Democrats, if you're a working class American, the Republicans, and I understand in an act of desperation, you may reach out to this guy who's promising you all this stuff. They take orphaning your causes to another level. They're just an absolute cold shoulder to that part of America.
They do, and they, and not that you know this, and I learned it on this trip, but those people bristle at the word, at the phrase working class. They don't like it. They said everybody.
I didn't know
class.
that. Why?
Yeah,
because
I didn't know that either.
Yeah.
They feel like that everybody's working class. Everybody has a job. They consider themselves, people in the manufacturing sector, and the manufacturing sector is one that has been forgotten politically. And all of the promises that have been made to that sector have not been kept. And the administration after administration has just seen jobs go to Mexico and cheaper jobs come in, and non-union workers, temporary workers who don't have to be paid the same kind of wages nor the same benefits that these other workers have to. They've seen that walk away. So they don't like being called working class because their feeling was, one of them said to me, "You're working class. You're here reporting. Everybody who's working class, someone who has a job. We have jobs, but we're manufacturers, and we've made this country and this region tick for a very long time, and we're forgotten." And we thought a lot of them thought they would take a chance on Trump, and they haven't been happy about it.
So they prefer to be referred to as, what was it again?
Manufacturers, people who work in the manufacturing sector, people with jobs. They just don't like the idea of working class because they think it paints a picture of just this monolith of white men who went to factories in the 1950s, and it's not that way anymore. And I saw every stripe from black to white to Hispanic to gay to straight. Everybody was there at these union halls picking up the pieces and helping their striking brethren in different parts of the country. And one of the other interesting facts is that when a big auto plant goes on strike, you don't realize that it affects other workers there, right? So there's a janitorial union there that's actually part of the UAW, and those workers make far less, and they're out of money. right? I mean, they don't get the same kind of strike pay, or they do get the strike pay, but it doesn't go as far because haven't been able to save for a strike because their regular pay is so bad. So these UAW workers, people who work the line, and the machinists and the wheel people, they set up a pantry so that anyone could come and get food and formula and toilet paper and everything, just give it away to the other members of the unions who aren't as fortunate to have the jobs they do when they are working.
Michael Shure, if the Democrats could actually rally this group, the industrial sector, if they could rally those people in the way that, as you say, they used to have a connection to, if they could rally them, is that a significant enough push to win a general election for the presidency?
I mean, it's a game breaker. It's an absolute game breaker because if you look at where most of those workers are traditionally, they are in states that have been blue but went to Donald Trump. So starting in Ohio, because Barack Obama in 2012 won Ohio, starting there but going to Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, states the Democrats have really had a hold on at the presidential level for a while. They lost those states, right? That would make an enormous difference. They realize it. The problem is that there is that perception, too, that Ohio specifically is farther to the red side than it is to the blue. So are their resources better spent in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania? I understand that argument, and there is, if you're spending them in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, they are trickling into Ohio. One thing that's interesting is there's a plant for natural gas being built that's going to employ 5,000 people in western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio. So Tim Ryan said to me, look at that plant. How are you going to tell these workers who fought for this plant that we're going to stop fracking and we're going to stop looking for natural gas when it creates 5,000 jobs, right? Well, he said the Democrats, fought forever to get away from fossil fuels into natural gas. And now natural gas is the enemy, and these people want jobs, and those are Democratic voters by and large because they're union people. And those are people that would traditionally been a part of what we would call Democrats. And they're lost. And so there are, it becomes, you start to see how difficult it is to be a Democrat, right? Because there are lots of factions under that umbrella of Democrat. From, you saw Dan Lipinski, he's a member of Congress who was upset that the Democrats are primarying him, and they're saying it's on abortion because he's a pro-life Democrat who's won tough races in Illinois. So you have pro-life and pro-choice. You have pro-natural gas, pro-fracking, and people who don't want to see it at all. And it's a very difficult balancing act. But Ryan sees it affecting that part of the country specifically.
It is a great point that there's such a plurality in the Democratic Party. I mean, the tent is so big, and you're serving so many masters. That's why these debates and a lot of these public comments can backfire, right? Because they don't play with all of those different masters that the Democrats have to bow to.
For sure, and there's a hangover into the general election from what they're talking about too, which and that's the power of incumbency. Look, when you had Barack Obama running for president as an incumbent in 2012, and there was a primary for the chance to run against him, they were doing all sorts of damage to each other on the Republican side that the Democrats exploited in the general. Well, the same thing's going to happen next year. So all of this talk, every single time they have a conversation about socialism, about Beto O'Rourke saying we're going to buy back your guns and we're going to take exemptions away from churches, tax exemptions if they preach from the pulpit about politics, et cetera, or they don't support gay marriage, or they don't perform gay marriages. That's all fine and good, and that appeals to a lot of Democrats. And these candidates are trying to break out from the pack by appealing to a group. That said, that it becomes a very difficult thing in the general election where Donald Trump is saying they're coming for your AR-15s, and they also want to make sure your churches don't get any tax exemption unless they marry gay couples. It's a tough thing. And
those people who rally around what you're just talking about, that those things that I think you're right, Trump will clearly articulate, those people will show up, and they'll show up in big numbers. And you've even done stories, I know, and we've talked about it here, but you've also done stories on television about just that fact, that the evangelical right, they come out in a big way. They won't miss it.
No, they won't miss it, and they'll tell you how they feel about a candidate really early. But if that's the candidate they're stuck with, they're going to vote for them. You saw that with Donald Trump, and they get what they come for. They got their judges, right? You have Kavanaugh and you have Gorsuch on the court right now. That if you told these evangelical voters in the Carolinas and in Iowa and in the Deep South that they would get these people, they would have been, really happy to vote for Donald Trump, and that's why they did. So they follow through, as opposed to the Democrats who, have greater purity tests. And it's not a criticism of having a purity test. If you like an issue and it's important to you, you should vote that issue. But there is a greater good for themselves, a selfish good. The Republicans are better at sort of, I would say, biting their tongues or holding their noses and going to the polls.
Yeah, and I would say falling into line. Yeah, but however you describe it, it's
their line is easier to fall in, right? I mean, there's a little bit more homogeneity on the Republican side from Republican voter to Republican voter than there is on the Democratic side, which makes it, like herding cats sometimes. But that said, yeah, they are better at following through and getting at least the issues that they want.
The Real Clear Politics poll in Iowa, and that's where this whole thing gets started. Now we are post-debate. It has Biden and Warren in a dead heat at 23%, Sanders at 13%, and Buttigieg at 16%. I want to ask you two things. First, too early to look at this stuff? What is this the result of? And also, it's been talked about a lot that Buttigieg, with a tremendous focus on Iowa, will do well there. That may propel him to even greater success. He's something of a darling.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are a few different takes on it. You have to define what doing well is, right? I mean, coming out of Iowa, if Joe Biden loses and Elizabeth Warren wins or Bernie Sanders wins, that will be the story, right? I mean, Pete Buttigieg doesn't have a place to go after Iowa. And in terms of a natural constituency, black people have not responded to him at all. So the first foray into the part of the country where they make up a big part of the Democratic electorate is in South Carolina, where he gets 0% with black voters, not 1%, 0%. So it will be tough. New Hampshire is obviously Sanders-Warren territory. And then Nevada is a place where Buttigieg has made some strides, but, it hasn't been polled as much as the others. The polls do matter. They matter more this year than any year because they qualify you for the debates. And if you're qualifying for the debates and you're doing well in those polls, then it really helps your campaign. I read an amazing article that I recommend everyone read by Tim Alberta. Tim is just a terrific writer for Politico magazine, and I say this without hyperbole, even though I sound like Joe Biden. He's the best writer of long-form politics in America, and he wrote a book called Carnage about the Republican Party, which he knows very well, and what Trump has done to the Republican Party, which I recommend. It's a big read. It's a good read, and I've read it.
Why aren't we talking to Tim Alberta instead of Michael Shure? Tim
Alberta would. I'm sure I can work it so that Tim Alberta makes it to your.
I'm just saying. I like talking to Michael, but it sounds like Michael believes Tim Alberta's the answer. All right.
Well, I'm going to be honest. I'd go toe to toe with him on precedent and history, but in terms of capturing the zeitgeist of these politics, I think he's really good at it.
I think a political cage match, a journalistic cage match. Why do you have us
fighting? All I'm doing is saying that he's good, Mark, and you have us fighting already.
Well, it's the new America. Everybody fights, Michael.
In any case, he wrote an article about Michael Bennet watching the debate. He watched the debate with the senator from Colorado, the only senator running who wasn't on that stage, and his frustrations with why he's not and how it's working out. But it has to do with those polls and making ground up in Iowa. So it's impressive, and that's where Elizabeth Warren has put her focus, and it has crept up for her and crept up really nicely. But again, it also put her in the hot seat the other night where people were going after her, particularly Buttigieg. And Bennett from afar and others from afar, they feel like it's a real piece of luggage for the Democrats in the general if she doesn't admit that she would have to raise taxes on the middle class to support her Medicare plan.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I just wonder why she doesn't say, look, it comes down to how much money you have to spend. If I'm going to reduce your overall bill for the year, then it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's a tax or however it's happening. I'm changing a system so that you'll have a lower nut every month. I think there's got to be a way to explain that. After all, Pete Buttigieg explained that. I think that video has been dusted off now and is making its way around the internet.
Correct. Yeah. It's important, right? I mean, and again, it opens you up to how the other side defines you. It's really important to define yourself in politics. And that's often an issue for a lot of these more progressive candidates who are making, great strides on the national political scene now, which is great for the progressives. But it also sets them up for what do we do with overpromisers, right? Well, we have a tough time in a general election having that. So if you're not able to defend and talk realistically about what your plan is, then it becomes fodder for the other side.
Yeah, look, I think it's so great that we get a chance to visit with you, and there's just so much going on. But I feel as though this is one of the big things to concentrate on. That said, I have to ask you about the, if you will, political ramifications and national and international ramifications of what's going on with Syria and a president who kind of seems to act impetuously. But let's just focus, and instead of you weighing in on the overall issues, you can talk about whatever you like, but I guess I want to ask you about the political part, that he is taking criticism from both sides of the aisle. I'm wondering how the arithmetic on Donald Trump politically has changed.
Well, I think politically, this is the evolution that those who are pushing for his impeachment were hoping for. And frankly, the only way you can successfully impeach a president, if that's what your goal is obviously to get the votes in the House, which they have, but to try and push that argument to the American people and to some reasonable Republicans on the other side who will admit to seeing what they see. It's easier for Republicans to admit that the president is at fault if the president's numbers in the polls and the public are down, and they are. And, people eat their own, right? I mean, they're going to run away from this president very quickly if he becomes toxic. Right now, he's not toxic to all of them, and many of them are campaigning and fundraising off of their association with the president still. So until that really changes, the sort of status of impeachment won't change. But, every day things get a little worse for this president, and there's a cumulative effect. And many people thought the cumulative effect would have taken its toll at this point. It hasn't yet, but it seems to now be having an effect that it hasn't had for a while. So it's something to watch. And certainly nothing can happen with this presidency unless there is some Republican conversation and action on getting rid of him.
I know you like predictions, and you make them, and you own it. You say, look, I make a lot of predictions, and a lot of them don't come to pass, but some of them do.
You want me to say, in Miami, at the Super Bowl, the 49ers, I'm going to say 31 and the Patriots 24.
Speaking of predictions that won't come to pass, I have a question. Our pal Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks believes that Donald Trump will resign very soon. I think. I mean, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but let's just go with that he's going to resign before his term. All right. And you're hearing about this, how he's taking so much fire and he's coming unraveled and all this sort of thing. Now, I will tell you where I sit. I do not think he will resign. I think he will not let go of power easily. I think he will fight this to the bitter end. And I think you can get Mitch McConnell and all the king's horses and all the king's men and go visit him, and he is not going to let go of the Oval Office easily. I'm asking you. So I've told you a Cenk, who is a knowledgeable guy, who definitely represents a strong body of opinion that Trump will resign before his term is up. And I've told you where I sit. I don't think he will. Where do you think the chips will fall?
Oh, man, this is a tough one. I don't think he's going to resign. I don't think he wants to go from the White House to the courthouse, as it were. And I think that unless there was some sort of understanding that he would not be prosecuted for things that we know already, I don't think he wants to get anywhere, close to a courthouse now. I do think it's going to be difficult for him to govern, but he hasn't governed typically anyway. I mean, this isn't, what Joe Biden's right about, in my opinion, is this is an aberration. I don't know that I'm going to be right about that prediction either, but I do think that this will, that there is this yearning to get back to normal from both sides. And I think that pressure on his administration is going to make it very difficult for him to govern it at all. But I don't see him resigning because I don't think what lies ahead for him after resignation is a cakewalk. So I think he wants to stay where he is. You also have to understand he's a rock star on tour a lot. So he's going to these rallies where they love him. It's intoxicating, and I don't think he wants to leave that stage, even though those rallies could continue to happen. I also don't think the Republicans want him on the outside needling them either. So I don't think they're going to press for anything like that.
Yeah. Why would you want to hasten the process that brings about your prosecution? Yeah, that's an additional factor, of course. Michael, I could talk to you longer, but then you would miss your plane for whatever other stop on the political tour you're on. So let me just thank you, and until next week, Michael Shure, everybody.
Thank you, folks. Thank you so much.
Never
It's great to be here,
disappoints.
Mark.
If you enjoy listening to The Edge, support them by subscribing to The Edge on iTunes, Stitcher, and you can listen through the iHeartRadio app. Get busy listening.
I am a fan of Derek Thompson. He's a great writer for Atlantic, and he picks subjects and areas of focus that totally escape attention. Loved his book Hitmakers, The Science of Popularity in an Age of Distraction, and he actually visited with us talking about that book. We may touch on it briefly in this conversation to come, but if you haven't heard that episode, you should go back and listen. He is Derek Thompson, everyone. Yes.
Hello. Good to be here. Thank you.
Derek, I really am a fan. I want to get to some of your pieces in The Atlantic. One of them has to do with the economy. In fact, you do a few things about the economy, and this particular one talks about wages. And you mentioned when we hear about wages, we always sort of hear the same story, that wages are stagnant and they've barely budged for the American worker in decades. And then we hear about inequality. But you sort of pull the curtain back on some additional statistics and additional facts about the economy.
Right. So what I really wanted to do here was to publicize what I thought was a topic that a lot of economists are talking about that just hadn't really seeped into national consciousness. And that fact is that wage growth for low-income workers has really accelerated in the last few years. It's really astonishing the degree to which wages for people who are working in low-income industries at clothing stores, supermarkets, amusement parks, casinos, wages for these people are actually growing faster than high-income wages. And in fact, the gap between low-income wages and high-income wages and the growth there is actually the highest it's been in the last 20 years. So there is a lot of focus, I think lots of it perfectly moral and reasonable, on the last 30 years of skyrocketing inequality, where the richest workers are making all the money. But quietly in the last few years, wage growth has been most stagnant for workers in high-wage industries, and it's workers in retail and restaurants who have actually seen the fastest wage growth. And that's something that is worth celebrating, worth investigating, and certainly worth pointing out to the general public.
And why do you suspect that that doesn't get the attention that the sort of the disparity in compensation gets, or that the stagnation in wages gets?
Yeah, I think, look, the fact that wage growth is accelerating for low-income workers is a piece of good news. It's just objectively good news. But I think there's two reasons why people are unlikely to hear about it. The first reason, I think, is that there's a kind of negativity bias among, maybe a lot of reporters, certainly among a lot of Democrats, who don't want to give or seem to give the president credit for something. Now, I don't think the president is uniquely responsible for this phenomenon. I don't think the president exerts that much control over the domestic economy at all. But I think that Democrats and liberals and maybe some members of the media who are antagonists of Donald Trump are unlikely to point out a good thing that's happening in the economy for fear of accidentally saying something positive about the president. On the other hand, I think that there are sort of more corporate-friendly outlets, like, say, the Wall Street Journal's editorial page, who should be reporting this statistic. And indeed, they are talking about it a little bit. But they're using it as an opportunity to take shots at Obama. They're using it as a way to sort of score political points against Democrats, rather than say the truth, which is that tight labor markets for low-income workers are really good, and the growth of minimum wages across the country has been really, really excellent for low-income workers. So essentially, Democrats don't want to talk about low-income wage growth because it feels too close to saying good things can happen while Trump is president. And Republicans don't want to talk about the reason behind this phenomenon because it seems dangerously close to saying, liberals were right to raise minimum wages and to focus on tight labor markets. But both things are true. Good things can happen while Trump is president, and minimum wage laws and tight labor markets have been fantastic for low-income workers. So I think it's really important to point out this point, investigate the reasons behind it, identify the reasons behind it, and say more of that, please, more wage growth for low-income Americans, please. Let's keep, raising minimum wages make sure that, that those raised minimum wages aren't having negative effects on their local economies. So far, it looks like they are not for the most part. And let's keep a focus at the Fed level, at the Washington level, at the tax level, at the spending level on tight labor markets, low unemployment, because that is a really important driver of low-income wage growth.
Well, you're so right about the fact that sort of all roads in every conversation and every issue lead back to politics. And when you actually look at policy, it almost doesn't even enter the conversation. It becomes sort of a knee-jerk tribal kind of conversation so quickly. But it is true that Donald Trump and his trade war did affect growth industries that the workers have found themselves quickly sort of locked out of, or increasingly locked out of.
Yeah, I mean, Trump's record on the economy has been complicated. On the one hand, I think, the corporate tax cut came with a short-term tax stimulus that was probably good for the economy. It put money in people's pockets. It probably increased spending. That's good for retail revenue and retail employment. The high deficits that we have now are concerning to some people, but they're not particularly concerning to me. A high federal deficit just means that people are paying low taxes. That means they're keeping a lot of their income, which means that they can spend a lot of their income. So I think the president's record on domestic economics has been somewhat positive. At the same time, the trade war has been a rather straightforward disaster. And its combination with his attacks on immigrants has created a scenario where not only are you sort of putting it to companies whose sort of product is tradable, that have sort of trading relationships with China and other countries that are subject to trade wars, but also there's a lot of jobs and a lot of sectors that would probably benefit from more immigration. Maybe urban economies, construction work. We might be able to build more houses more effectively if we had faster immigration growth. So I think that his record on economics has been complicated overall.
I'm glad you touch on it, because I always call it the gray economy. I mean, the truth is that when it comes to construction, as you said, restaurant and service industries associated with things like restaurants, and when it comes to agriculture, you really depend on what is sort of this gray economy. People who are paying taxes or who are earning wages, but who are frankly off the grid as far as citizenship's concerned. Yeah,
I feel like unfortunately they're sort of caught in the crosshairs of Trump's ideological war on international trade deficits. If you punish other countries that buy a lot of farmers' stuff, whether it's soy, grain, whatever, then that's going to be really bad for American farms, particularly for maybe smaller farms and immediate-sized farms that have smaller profit margins. And as a result, if you're waging a trade war and you're hurting these farms, then maybe you think, okay, well, I have to, bail out the farmers specifically. But there's sort of other companies that are being hurt by these trade wars, maybe steel manufacturers or other companies that do a lot of, international trade. I just don't think that in the period of declining global trade, you should be waging aggressive trade wars here and there. And so that would be where I think I have strong disagreements with the president's economic policy.
Oh, that's interesting, too. I hadn't even thought of that. I was kind of concentrating on the immigration, but you're saying, the policy's flawed in other ways as well. And that seems demonstrably clear. But you're right. There are other industries than those who have been getting the bailout who are affected.
Absolutely. To your point briefly, I do think, look, the president's record in immigration has been absolutely horrendous. I mean, it's a much clearer point there for me than it is with domestic economics, where the president has done a lot of different things that, aren't, some of which are probably not positive, some of which, probably might come out in the wash. I think the corporate tax cut was bad in the long term, but we don't live in the long term. We live in 2019. On immigration, though, specifically, the lack of respect really for human rights, I think, has been a moral blot on the Trump administration. And there, my opinion, the president isn't, on the one hand, on the other hand, it's on one hand. And that hand simply says the president's record's been terrible.
And before we leave the subject completely, 2 points, one of which is when you come in with so much political currency, apparently, I mean, I couldn't understand it, but I was not alone. Many people didn't think Donald Trump was actually going to win the election. It was all sort of a brand builder for him. And then he ended up walking away with it. And he did come in with a political capital, a political currency, as it turns out, and it was spent right away on this tax cut, which they rushed through. And it was a tax cut which, as you suggest, did stimulate the economy at the highest levels, but it was driven largely, I thought, by stock buybacks. That whole idea that somehow the working man is going to benefit from it, not so much, certainly after the first year. Isn't that right, Derek?
That's absolutely right. I mean, look, a corporate tax cut is a cut on the income that corporations earn. So it's a first-order benefit not to workers but to companies. Now, maybe companies are going to spend that money on workers. Maybe they're going to spend it on paying workers more or hiring more workers or expanding benefits to workers. But as you said, we saw that a lot of this money was spent, especially early on corporate buybacks, which means, again, that it is used to support the stock valuation and the shareholders of the companies and not necessarily the employees. Look, there may be reasons to reduce the marginal tax rate on corporate income. We don't need to get into a really, really wonky debate on, like, the ideal marginal tax rate on corporate income. Might be good reasons to bring it down from its sort of historic level in the U.S., which was relatively high. But doing so in the way that the Republican tax cut did was clearly a long-term regressive tax cut that disproportionately benefits companies in the long run.
All right, I want to move on. And when we talk about economies and engines of the economy and centers of economic growth and just the consumer economy even, you look at major cities. You did a piece in The Atlantic called Why Are America's Three Biggest Metros Shrinking? And you focus on this New York, LA, and Chicago phenomenon, which is associated with people leaving those cities. Yeah.
So really it seems like for the first time in 100 years, America's three largest metro areas are all shrinking at the exact same time. New York is losing 277 people each day. Los Angeles is losing 201 people each day. Chicago is losing 161 residents each day. Each of them are shrinking. Where are these people going? Well, they tend to be going to the south and to the west. They're going to basically what you might consider the Sun Belt, from sort of North Carolina down through Texas into Phoenix and Las Vegas. And, I think this is a really important development. It's important for a variety of reasons, whether you live in a city and you're worried about sort of, demand for housing, or whether you're interested in sort of the future of the distribution of votes. A lot of people are leaving blue cities in blue states, and they're moving to blue metros in red states, and that could move states like Arizona into the Democratic column by 2020 or 2024. So I think that's a really important point. But in terms of the reason why this is happening, it's pretty simple. There's three ways that a city can grow: babies, movers, and immigrants. Babies, movers, immigrants. And these metro populations are declining because of all three of those things. Babies, number one, you see declining fertility rates across the U.S. Number two, movers. People tend to move to cities like New York and Chicago and Boston when they're in their 20s, and they tend to leave those dense areas in their late 20s, early 30s when they start to have a family, either moving to the suburbs of other metros or moving to small towns. And then number three, immigrants. Like I said, Trump's antagonism toward immigrants, which I think of as a pure negative, has had a purely negative impact on immigration. According to Bill Frey, who's a Brookings demographer, immigration rates declined by 70 to 80% in the first 2 years of Trump's presidency, 70 to 80%. Now, for the last few decades, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, and a lot of other large metros had relied really heavily on immigration in order to grow their populations. That essentially they were net losing American movers, but they were continuing to grow because immigrants were coming in to those cities to start their lives before moving on. And as you have declining immigration, you therefore have declining populations in these metro areas. So there are a variety of reasons why it's happening, but in the big picture, it's really important not only to these metro economies if you live there, but also really to the future of American politics.
I mean, so well said. And then you break down the numbers in your piece. And again, we'll post a link to it on our website, edge-show.com. But you talk about the fact that from 2010 to 2018, immigration accounted for more than 100% of population growth in the cities of New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. And so this is a massive engine of growth.
In New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, more than 80% of population growth in Los Angeles and Boston were from immigration. I mean, big cities grow because of immigrants. A lot of people don't realize this. They think that unless you have sort of net positive immigration from other American counties, you're going to shrink. Well, guess what? Every single year this century, Chicago and New York have lost American movers. This is, they always lose domestic migrants going back, 20 years. This is not the case for cities like Phoenix and Dallas and Las Vegas. Those cities are growing in large part because Americans are moving to them. But the reason that a lot of these, especially coastal cities, grow over time is because of immigration. And so if you have declining immigration, you will have declining population.
The other thing you talk about is in the enrichment of these cities, and that is to say, in the growth of these cities, and you do talk about sort of the way there's been this renaissance, historically, the way these cities have grown. The renaissance has affected the downtown area, and these regions that were formerly sort of bad neighborhoods, or the core of the city might have been a little seedy. They've now been gentrified and otherwise changed, and they've evolved to these places that are where all of the young professionals have gravitated, but it's become much more expensive to live there. In fact, it's priced out a lot of the population that used to occupy that part of the city.
No, there's no question that the revitalization of downtown areas has been, A, really clear and obvious phenomenon in the last 20, 30 years, and B, somewhat complicated in terms of its effects. Now, I think overall, increased safety in what I suppose we call the inner city in downtown areas, the fact that the murder rates here have declined and the robbery rates have declined and the rape rates have declined and the violent assault rates have declined, this is just objectively good. And it's not as if this crime has been exported dramatically. Cities have just gotten safer. I mean, New York City today, Manhattan, is on a per capita basis one of the safest cities in American history. The murder rate has fallen really, really dramatically there since the 1990s. And that's really fantastic. At the same time, what's clearly happened is that these cities, as they become safer and a little bit glitzier and revitalized, they become really expensive places to live. And as less housing has been built in some of them, especially places like Los Angeles and San Francisco, housing costs have gone up, and it's priced out a lot of middle-class people and middle-class families. So, that concerns me a bit. I would like to see the city sort of reclaim its old historic status as being a place where families can congregate, not just where rich single people can live. And I do have a fear that cities are becoming sort of entertainment machines for the young and rich. But again, I think it's a good thing that they've clearly become, safer.
These immigrant populations, they so enrich the texture of all of these places. The immigrants from Vietnam and China and Dominican Republic, you mentioned in your article, and Mexico. In Latin America. So I think it's a sad fact that much of that is on a downtick,
Yeah, it is. And look, it's a hard balance. The solution, however, is not particularly complicated. You need to build more houses. You need to find ways to build more multifamily housing, more tall apartment complexes that have some units that are reserved for middle-class pricing. I don't know another way to fix the problem.
I will again link to that article on our website, edge-show.com. As I mentioned when I was introing you, you shed light on things that oftentimes, most of the time, I'm not aware of, and even sometimes in a sector of news and even existing headlines that I had never seen. And so was the case with the piece you did on the rich kids' sports. I forget what your headline was, but it was something along the lines of, hey, look. It wasn't, hey, look, because they don't put, hey, look in headlines. But it was a way to draw attention to there's something else going on in the way rich kids get in legitimately to institutions of higher learning. And it's got nothing to do with payoffs and underhanded stuff. It's got to do with sports, legit sports, but they are rich kids' sports.
Yeah. So this was a really interesting piece to me, and frankly, a subject that I didn't really know a lot about. I was really interested in the lawsuit between a group representing Asian American students and Harvard University. And the claim of this lawsuit was that Harvard University was discriminating against Asian Americans, and that it was discriminating against them essentially by finding ways to reject really smart Asian Americans because they were deficient at certain scores like personality or athletic ability. So during the course...
didn't mean to interrupt, Derek, but I want to just make it clear. The thinking on the part of these institutions was there are too many Asian kids getting into this school if we just evaluate them on academic merit. I mean, honestly, that's just bottom line what they were thinking.
Very possibly. I'm not going to fight that interpretation. I don't know for 100% that that's what Harvard was thinking and what they were discussing, but sure. it would not surprise me if that interpretation is indeed their motivation.
Anyway, go ahead.
I'm definitely not going to fight that. No, sure. So basically, in the process of this lawsuit, economists and lawyers learned a lot, an unprecedented amount about how Harvard thinks about admissions. This is a gold mine of data to figure out how the world's most prestigious university thinks about admitting students. And what they found was fascinating. Everybody knows about the ethical issue of legacy admissions. This idea that if your parent or your uncle or your grandfather went to some school, then you have a leg up to go there. And the issue most people have with it is that it's unmeritocratic, that it gives rich white kids a chance to keep repopulating privilege just sort of infinitely throughout generation after generation, because the dad went to Harvard, the son goes to Harvard, the grandson goes to Harvard, the great, et cetera, and that's wrong, morally wrong.
And you see it among our leaders or presidents. George Bush is a classic example.
Exactly. But what the data seem to indicate is that the recruited athletes that get into Harvard are A, more numerous than the legacy students, B, as white or whiter than the legacy students, and C, just about as rich as the legacy students. But it turns out that Harvard has an enormous athletic recruitment program that essentially is acting or is a de facto rich white kid recruitment program. That Harvard wants to make sure that students want to make sure that a certain share of its class are, kids that are paying full freight, paying the full sticker price, and they are using the athletic recruitment program in order to identify kids who are way richer than the typical Harvard student, more likely to be white, and that concerns me because it suggests that sports recruitment at the world's most prestigious academic institution, not sports institution, but academic institution, that sports recruitment there is not about academics, and it's not about equality of opportunity. It is essentially an affirmative action program for white affluence. And there's a lot of data that backs this up, and I can go into some of it. It can get a little bit wonky just in terms of comparing rates of admissions. But that's
one thing I remember from
using this program.
Yeah, one thing I remember from your piece was the fact that, and this is a startling stat, I don't remember the precise stat, but I remember the idea, the number, and maybe it was a percentage of these students who are involved in these programs, and we talk about these rich kid sports, I'll just call them, lacrosse and water polo and stuff like that. I mean, things that, you can't get a pickup lacrosse game in the inner city, you know what I mean? But these things that require coaching and leagues and money and are generally white, they are oversized in some of these big institutions like Harvard.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look, starting with Harvard has 1,200 undergraduates, 20% of the student body, participating in intercollegiate athletics. That's more student athletes than Ohio State. Ohio State's total undergrad population is 7 times larger than Harvard. It's 46,000, but Harvard has more intercollegiate athletics. Or intercollegiate athletes. I mean, it's really remarkable how large this program is. As you said, this is a problem that doesn't just exist at the admissions level. It starts early on. Unfortunately, and I've written a couple articles about this, youth sports has essentially become just another system of reproducing privilege, that you have declining youth sport participation, and the decline is coming from the middle and lower classes as the upper class pays more and more money for their kids to go into travel leagues and to go into select leagues that don't belong to the sort of the community's youth sport, rec leagues, but rather require these parents to sort of buy into something that sort of straddles several districts. As a result, sort of across the Ivy League, there's a lot of sports that you might not think of as rich white kid sports that nonetheless are dominated by rich and white kids. So Black and Hispanic students account for less than 10% of Ivy athletes, less than 10%, in baseball, cross country, fencing, field hockey, golf, ice hockey, lacrosse, rowing, sailing, skiing, softball, squash, tennis, volleyball, water polo, and wrestling. I mean, it's just remarkable the degree to which sports across the Ivy League attract a group of students that just happens to be whiter than the general population. And also, by the way, richer. According to the Harvard Crimson, families of recruited athletes at Harvard are twice as likely as non-recruits to come from families earning more than $500,000 than from families earning less than $80,000. So they are richer and they are whiter. And it's just concerning to me because I don't want the most prestigious academic institutions in the U.S. to essentially be running shadow admissions programs for the affluent through a sports recruitment program. It just doesn't seem appropriate to me.
Right. We hold these institutions in such positions of prestige, and then to suggest that, in essence, they are really just pipelines, oftentimes, these programs, to perpetuate the domination of rich white kids in the society and the culture. It's galling, honestly.
Exactly.
And you know, just because we're talking about youth sports, I think you did a piece about how much money there is in youth sports, how it's really like when you come down to some of these sports, and it's not even always water polo and lacrosse and all of those things, just in general youth sports like baseball and softball. And I know people that have these kids on these travel leagues, and it costs the family a lot of money to sort of maintain that. You just alluded to that just a moment ago. They can outspend even like professional sports leagues in terms of supporting them.
Yep, that's exactly right. I mean, look, the decline of youth sports participation, is a subject that a lot of parents care a lot about. A lot of parents wrote me when I published this article. But here's basically the money stat, and this is why it's a story that's not just about American childhood, but rather about American inequality. Overall, youth sports participation is declining. But if you look closely at the numbers, it's a two-track story. Among richer families, youth sports participation is going up. Among poorer households, it's trending down. So just a third of children from families earning less than $25,000 played at least one sport a day in 2017. It was twice as high in homes earning more than $100,000. And that gap is widening. So again, if you're a university that is going to give great weight to athletic excellence, then you are giving great weight to an extracurricular activity that is being monopolized by upper-class families and middle upper-class families. So I think that it's an understudied issue. It's an under-talked about issue. But as long as we're going to sort of put our finger on the pulse of meritocracy in America, you just have to think about it.
And the reason I would say, lastly, 2 points, youth sports is frankly, it's an island of calm for so many kids who need it. And I'm talking about kids who grow up in environments that are less than good, And so
I think that's a great point. And I would say lastly that, one of my concerns, I've talked to a couple of people who were college athletes, who are student athletes, who many of them have said, look, student athlete is a misnomer. It's really, really difficult to be both a student and an athlete at the exact same time. And one thing that's sort of concerning about this for me is, like, sports are supposed to be a departure from work. Sports are supposed to be respite. They're supposed to be recreational activities. And I'm a little bit concerned about a society that has turned these pastimes into a critical sort of function by which we determine whether people get into Harvard, by which we determine whether or not people have a chance to get some of the best jobs in the country. And that's another piece of the puzzle that we haven't talked about briefly, but there's some evidence that at elite firms, elite investment firms, marketing firms, there's lots of questions in the application process about, like, what sports did you play? Did you play the right kind of sports, the kind of sports that rich kids play? And so, I see the role that sports is playing in American childhood and American early adulthood, and it is concerning to me. It does seem to be sort of falsely meritocratic. It seems to provide an even playing field for children while de facto offering a way for affluence and privilege to reproduce itself over generations.
I'll link to that story, too, a couple of them. The other thing is that this is a huge engine, as it turns out, economic engine. I didn't realize how much money is in all of these sports. That is also self-perpetuating. Everybody's getting so rich with these leagues. I'm talking about those that organize the leagues, those that put the leagues in touch with these various academic institutions that arrange scholarships, all this kind of thing. There's so much money in it that it would seem almost by definition corrupts it.
Yeah, and it could be it. I mean, the amount of money that colleges spend on athletic scholarships has absolutely exploded in the last decade. But, you know, the sports can still play a pernicious role when there aren't athletic scholarships. You know, Harvard doesn't have athletic scholarships. A lot of Ivy League schools do not offer athletic scholarships. In fact, what they're doing by not offering athletic scholarships is saying the athletes who come here are going to have to pay full freight. Well, and if the athletes that go there have to pay full freight, they have to be able to afford it. And if they can afford full freight at a place like Harvard, which is, you know, whatever, $250,000 education, $200,000 education, then they got to be really rich. And that means that essentially your sports recruitment program is, in fact, a affluent recruitment program. So the money does play a role here. You know, I think that it's possible that sports is rather sort of sewn through with immorality at the college level. You know, the fact that student athletes are not paid is a part of it, and the fact that there's all this money going toward athletic scholarships might be a part of it. But, you know, even at a place like Harvard where there are no athletic scholarships, I still think that there can be problems.
Before I lose you, Derek Thompson, quickly a moment on your great book called Hitmakers. Hitmakers, for those who aren't familiar with it, the title says it all. Hitmakers, the science of popularity in an age of distraction. Here we are, inundated by all of these different things, and yet you talk about the things that punch through those distractions in your book. I'm just give us a second or two on that, because I loved the read.
Yeah, thank you. I loved writing it. It was a really fun book to write. So yeah, Hitmakers is about the science of popularity, and it uses stories of hits in popular culture to investigate the question of why do we like what we like, and how do we make things that other people like. And to the extent that there's any sort of, you know, the biggest thesis in the book is this concept that I call the familiar surprise. It's this idea that we tend to think that people are really into new things, that we want to buy, you know, we love new clothes and new movies, we listen to new music, we seek out new podcasts and television shows. But in fact, the thing that most likely sort of predicts that which we enjoy is the idea to which something is familiar, the idea that it's only subtly surprising. You know, one of the oldest ideas in psychology is this idea of the mere exposure effect, which basically says that the mere exposure of anything to us over time biases us toward whatever the stimulus is. You know, in English, that means we have a deep animalistic biological preference for familiar things, familiar food. We like familiar songs and chord progressions. We like ideas that are familiar and you know, movies that use familiar plot lines and familiar characters. I mean, just look at Hollywood today. The fact that sequels and adaptations and reboots have totally taken over the North American box office. So throughout the book, I'm really sort of using this theory of the familiar surprise to explain hits in music and film and internet culture and startups and tech, and just showing how this law of the familiar surprise, you know, dictates popularity across the economy.
I don't know, in your book, you actually talk about things like Instagram and other sort of high-tech apps that have become so much a part of our lives that we've really sparked to. So I mentioned Instagram. I know you talk about it in your book. Give everybody a sense of that, please. Well,
you know, with Instagram in particular, I think that, and with, I guess, you know, across social media, you really do just find that people, you know, the news feed itself, the algorithm itself that determines what we see, is essentially an algorithm that is written by our familiarities. It says you tend to like this kind of thing. You tend to like, you know, following these kind of stories and looking at these kind of photos, maybe following these kind of nature pictures. And we're going to design sort of the perfect feed, the perfect sort of series of stimuli to keep you engaged with the platform. And, you know, a lot of these different companies working on like the perfect machine, the perfect algorithm for maintaining human attention have rediscovered this principle of the familiar surprise. So one great example that I use in the book, one of my favorite examples from the book, is Spotify, the music streaming company. Spotify has this app called Discover Weekly, which is a list of 30 new songs that they download to your account every single Monday. And initially, Discover Weekly was supposed to be a pure discovery mechanism. And they wanted it to be all new songs by all new artists for people to discover. And as they were testing this algorithm internally, they accidentally let a bug slip through the algorithm. Accidentally, a lot of familiar songs, familiar artists started appearing in people's Discover Weekly feeds, and so they fixed the bug. They took it out. And when they took out this bug, they found that engagement with the app actually declined, shockingly, because it turned out that having just a few familiar songs and familiar artists in your Discover Weekly feed made you more likely to engage with it. And this, I think, is a really powerful idea that, having a bit of familiarity in your Instagram feed, in your Facebook feed, in your Hollywood movie, in your song, having that sort of ideal, optimal amount of familiarity is the key to making it a popular product. And I think this is just the kind of idea that can truly be extended into just about any kind of enterprise.
That's why I love it. It is a cut-through idea. The book is Hitmakers, The Science of Popularity in an Age of Distraction from Derek Thompson. The other articles, which are equally intriguing, I will post links on our website, edge-show.com. Derek, I remain a fan. Thanks for spending some time with us, and I'm sure we'll speak again.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Hope you liked our conversations with Michael and Derek. There are click-throughs for Derek's articles and his book on our website, edge-show.com. And until next time, bye-bye.
This is Donald J. Trump, President of the United States. Mark Thompson is a huge loser. His show, very bad, weak, soft. But if you're interested in crap and you're a communist, you can go to edge-show.com. I don't recommend it.